Is Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, a racist? That's basically the focus of this video, because the left have been increasingly criticizing her rhetoric recently. And, this is one of those stories that it's just one of many things that I could talk about. On any given day, there's any number of news stories. I thought, oh, that would make an interesting video. Actually, I think this is maybe a bit more symbolic of a wider debate on what is racism, what things should be spoken about, not spoken about, and how race can be weaponized by both left and right. Um, so I'm going to be quoting The Guardian here, which is not my go-to paper. I've actually bought it the other day um, for the coverage of the death of Dame Mary Quant. She had, of course, been one of the big figures of 1960s Britain. In fact, she was basically symbolic of the fashion of the swinging 60s. That's a cover. Um, I mean, I'm by no means into fashion, but you think swinging London, you think basically Carnaby Street, the Beatles, and Mary Quant. She's credited with inventing the miniskirt, although there's some debate about that. But anyway, that's why I bought the paper. But I ended up looking at this story. Um, so I'm just going to read out their op-ed on this because it pretty much sums up their way of thinking, and then, as I always do, offer my own thoughts on this. Okay, so this is uh, this is the opinion piece from the paper, so there's no specific journalist named here. Suella Braverman, buck stops of Rishi Sunak on this vindictive campaign. It's not very long, so bear with me. Even in politics, and certainly in more normal settings, it takes a lot to challenge a colleague openly, to weigh the consequences of a public criticism before making it, not least for one's family, is understandable. That is perhaps especially true when the critic and the colleague share a political party and both are from ethnic minorities. All of these concerns, Sayeeda Farsi wrote this week, went through her mind before she finally penned the Guardian article accusing the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, of racism and of playing politics in the gutter after she had branded British Pakistani men as child sex abusers. However difficult, writing the article was the right thing to do. The Home Secretary has been getting away with her politics of performative cruelty and vindictiveness for too long. Every unchallenged provocation she makes only increases her boldness. Her comments that the members of the sexual grooming gangs are almost all British Pakistani who hold cultural attitudes completely incompatible with British values were deliberately loose, unconsciously inflammable, and were not based on the facts that as a lawyer and a senior minister she has an obligation to uphold. These were not dog whistles but racist language. The grim reality is that there are sexual predators in every community, not just one. The nuances and specifics matter, of course, and I'm going to come back to that because it's an important point. But the 2013 report by the Children's Commissioner for England concluded that children were being sexually abused in every town, village, or hamlet. The Office for National Statistics estimated in 2020 that at least 3.1 million Britons had been sexually assaulted as children. That's an appalling statistic. And the Home Office report the same year found that most members of sex abuse gangs are white and aged under 30, not brown and middle aged. According to the former chief prosecutor Nazir Afzal, who led the high profile case against the Rochdale grooming gang in 2012, the vast majority of these crimes are carried out by white British males. Um, Now, I'm not sure why he felt obliged to say that. I'll come back to that one as well. To single out one community does not just encourage racist responses against them, it also puts the victims of sexual predators in other communities at greater risk. Miss Braverman's recklessness is not careless, it's a strategy. She doesn't do nuance, accuracy, or thoughtfulness. She does what avances the cause closest to her heart of becoming Conservative leader. She was a second-rate Attorney General who politicised a post that used to be strictly advisory. As Home Secretary under Liz Truss, she cast herself as an alpha achiever who would get small boats stopped, suspects searched and arrested, and protesters cleared away. After 6 weeks, with none of it achieved, she had to resign. 6 days later, after promising her support to Rishi Sunak in the ensuing leadership contest, she returned to the Home Office and the sadistic rhetoric resumed. Statistics a pretty strong word. The question now, as Lady Varzi points out, is to know who owns the rhetoric, racist rhetoric strategy, and then to put it to an end. Is it a Conservative Party approach that is intended to stoke fear and anger as the general election nears, or is it part of Miss Braverman's own plans to keep herself in the headlines and parade herself as a candidate of the hard right? The real concern is that it's a mix of both, and that Mr. Sunak, by embracing the stopping of the small boats as one of his 5 pre-election aims and putting Miss Braverman in charge of it, is himself complicit in the Home Secretary's theatre of cruelty. Okay, there's a lot to break down there. I'll try not to make this video too long because I do have a habit of talking too much. But basically, there's a lot to break down. The Guardian is getting into a wider issue there about her whole tenure as Home Secretary, and it's one of the great offices of state. It's huge responsibility, and there's a lot of areas involved in that. It's national security, it's policing, it's immigration. There's a lot of areas that come into the Home Office's jurisdiction. Um, Let me just say for the record, I'm not overly impressed by Suella Braverman. I do think that there are question marks over her being in the role, given that she broke the ministerial code. And, it's yet another case of Tory sleaze in that sense. Why did she get the job? And one can't help but wonder, did she do some sort of deal with the Prime Minister? Why did Sunak bring her on? I think he should have made probably someone like Penny Mordaunt Home Secretary. But it is what it is. She's Home Secretary. Some of the things that The Guardian is criticising her for example, moving on protesters, that's clearly a reference to Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. Well, that's something that the vast majority want action on. The vast majority are fed up with them. Um, so, the Guardian's trying to portray her as this sort of hard right agitator and implying that there isn't actually, that it's a fringe far right opinion. And they're quoting senior conservatives. It isn't just Baroness Vardy, there's others. Steve Baker, famous for his hardline views on Brexit, has criticised her. Tom Tugendhat, the former head of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, um, that's not the verbatim title, but anyway, senior Tories are criticising her because I think they recognise that there's a sort of toxic image with some of the things she's saying. At least that is one school of thought. I'm a bit more divided on this. I do think that some of her rhetoric is unhelpful. For example, talking about an invasion regarding the small boats. Invasion has a very specific meaning. We think of what Russia done to Ukraine. That's an invasion. An invasion suggests a concerted effort by a group of people or a nation state to invade another country or territory. What we're seeing with the small boats is a very pressing issue, but invasion is just not the right way to sum it up. It's a crisis, it's a major problem, and it has to be resolved. But is it an invasion? Are these people, actively trying to take over Britain? No, they're not. At least the vast majority are not. I think in that sense it is an irresponsible thing to say. Um, and it frankly is echoing some of the things the far right would say. But I'm a bit suspicious about the left in their vilification of Suella Braverman, and they are vilifying her. They're basically calling her all the names under the sun. She's a racist, she's pandering to the far right, and they are vilifying her. Some of that is probably true. I think she's an ambitious woman, as was her predecessor, Priti Patel, but she's even more hardline than Priti Patel. And I think there is some truth in the fact that because she's an ethnic minority herself, she probably thinks she can push the rhetoric further than, say, a white Tory could. But let's look at this thing about Pakistani men, British Pakistani men, because that's a very important point, and it's something that the left has absolutely weaponized. I'm not sure why the chief prosecutor Nazir Afzal felt the need to say that, because independent studies have shown that in certain areas, I mean, the Guardian itself says the nuances and specifics matter. Well, the fact of the matter is, in towns like Rochdale and Rotherham and some other towns, was a very specific problem of British Pakistani men grooming predominantly white victims. So, the bigger issue here is that predators come from all races, and that is true. That's a statement of fact as well. But nobody has actually said it's only British Pakistani men doing this. Um, I mean, at no point, from what I could tell, has Braverman actually said that. But she has said that there is a cultural attitude here. And she's actually not the first senior Tory to point this out. Sajid Javid raised this. He also got criticised, not as heavily, but he also got criticised at the time. And what is he? A British Pakistani man. Um, Majid Nawaz, who unfortunately has went down a bit of a rabbit hole, but when he was a bit more logical, he also strongly condemned these grooming gangs and a particular cultural thing that was going on. No one that I can tell has ever said it's only British Pakistani men doing it. We know that there's white predators out there. I mean, Britain's a majority white country, so basic common sense would suggest that predators, like any other group of people, is more likely to be dominated by the majority demographic, which is still white. But there has been specifics in certain areas, and here's the problem that the Guardian and the left are not recognising. They're saying, "Oh, it's a generalisation of an entire demographic, therefore it's racist." But what they're failing to recognise is that it's precisely this fear of being called racist that meant in towns like Rochdale and elsewhere, that's precisely the problem. Whereas where white predators are concerned, there's no racial factor there, right? Um, there's other issues. I mean, the whole Jimmy Savile thing that was about him being protected by the BBC and sort of his establishment status as a celebrity. But where there are minority predators, there is this cowardly, spineless, politically correct attitude, or we better not talk about it because it would be racist to do so. The Labour MP, Anne Cryer, got called a racist for raising this issue. This is where the Guardian is being fundamentally dishonest. It's where the left is being fundamentally dishonest. More broadly, they will not admit that they still weaponize race. They will not admit that when these specifics are brought up, then it's almost immediately shut down by, well, we can't talk about that. It's racist to say that. And they do the same thing with crime more broadly. In London, for example, there is a very serious problem, as we all know, with young black men killing each other. But the left, no, you can't talk about that, it's racist. So the whole issue with stop and search, um, one of the findings in the recent report of the Metropolitan Police was that young black men are disproportionately targeted. Now, I'm not going to say that there's no racism in the Met. Very clearly there is. But you have to also look at, well, why are they being more targeted? Is this because Metropolitan Police officers are racist? Or is it because actually there is a higher proportion of young black men in London involved in crime? But, what I've just said, the left would immediately say, oh, that's racist, you can't say it. The biggest issue I have with the left is they basically put up this block on talking about race when it's involving minorities. The only time they think it's okay to talk about race is when it's talking about how awful white people are and how racist white people are. I think they're fundamentally dishonest about this. Um, Now, on the issue of the grooming gangs, is it maybe a little irresponsible to just focus on the British Pakistani grooming gangs when there are other grooming gangs? Perhaps, but I think it's missing the point. Saying that that's racist is missing the point. In those areas, there was specific targeting by specific demographics, um, and the reason it wasn't dealt with sufficiently, or it took too long to be dealt with, is because of fear of racism. And that's the difference between that and white grooming gangs, where there's no fear of racism, and that's something the left will not be honest about. Um, It's even the same with the Manchester Arena bomber. Apparently, there was a failure to apprehend him because of fears of it being seen as racism. This is something that the left say, "Oh no, that's just hot air. That's something the right's exaggerating." No, there is empirical evidence for this, and they do it time and time and time again. I cannot stand that hypocrisy. So, for example, let's say you have a far right attack. such as the attack on Joe Cox MP. The left will absolutely be shouting from the rooftops about the threat from the far right and how it needs to be tackled. Yet, when there is an Islamist attack, they'll say, oh, it's a terrorist attack, it's awful. But they refuse to talk about the ideology. They refuse to say this is a problem with Islamic extremism. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because The Guardian quotes Baroness Farsi. Now, Baroness Farsi is a Tory, but she is one of those who, in my opinion, is guilty of trying to downplay discussion of this problem of Islamic extremism. You know, when I remember the debate on Question Time, it would have been some years ago now, but I was discussing Abu Hamza, the hate preacher. Her attitude was, oh, he's just a nutter that's just, he doesn't represent Islam. That's a typical sort of dismissive response from people who want to deny there is a very specific problem with Islamic extremism. And they will weaponize so called Islamophobia to try and silence legitimate debate. In Scotland, the new First Minister, Humza Yousaf, is doing this right now, shamefully. Because of his pretty lax record as a minister, the fact that certain crimes have got out of control in Scotland, his record is far from impressive. Transport, crime. What's he doing? He's playing the race card, basically. He's saying that the criticism against me is racism. That's a disgrace. Um, I'm not going to say there's no racism in politics. I'm not going to say that it doesn't exist. I mean, this week there was a Tory councillor, I think it was in Wales, who allegedly said all white men should keep black slaves. Now, that's an ongoing investigation. He says he won't comment on it because he wants to respect the process. If he really said it, he should be sacked. Because, even if he was saying it as some sort of shock for shock's sake, it's incredibly stupid. If he really means it, then he has no business being in public life, obviously. But, let's see what the investigation shows. I think, to me, it sounds a little bit too obvious. It sounds like it might be a setup. I don't know. It just sounds like such a. I don't think an actual racist would be that foolish, especially if they're in public office. I don't know. I think they'd be more careful about what they say. I don't think they would be that blunt about it. But I don't know. Maybe he is, in which case he should be disciplined. Why would you get into public life? It's a bit like, I'll just mention this because I don't know if I'm going to make a separate video. I probably won't. One of the other things they're criticising Braverman for is she stood up for that pub in Grays in Essex, which showed the gollywogs on its window. The issue there is the way I've looked into that is I don't particularly care for the pub. I think they probably are a bit bigoted, and I think gollywogs have no place in modern Britain. I think they're archaic and racially offensive. There is an argument to be made that their origins are not necessarily depicting black people, but really, I think just common sense would dictate that most people nowadays associate with that, rightly or wrongly, that's what's associated with. But regardless, whether it's racist or not, the issue there was that you had five police officers turning up, right? The owners are being investigated for a hate crime. Now, I think it's fair to ask, what are the police doing with the resources? Is there not assaults to be worked on? Is there not, you know, rape cases to work on? I just think that this is another example of police resources going to the wrong place. I mean, basically, does an offensive doll really warrant five police officers? The police are always saying the resources are stretched. So I think that's the issue, and I think that's why the Home Secretary intervened. Um, that doesn't mean I support the gollywogs. I wouldn't go to that pub personally, and I think they're probably being stubborn in saying, "Oh, it's harmless. We'll just put them up again." If you're in a business, why polarize potential customers? It's just stupid. Stupid business model. Um, but they're having a go at Braverman for that. I think she's recognizing that a lot of people feel that police resources are being wasted. Um, because she's recently said that the police should not be focusing on non-crime hate incidents. They should not be policing hurt feelings. Now that's something she's been consistent about, and I happen to agree with that. And I think many people would. But the Guardian's twisting that, and the left's twisting that she's pandering to the far right. Um, anyway, I'll wrap this up. Is she racist? I don't know. I just don't know what is in her conscience, what's in her. I certainly think it's possible for minority people to be racist, and I think it's possible for minorities to be racist against other minorities. So it's possible that she does have a bigoted streak. I think some of her language is unhelpful, and there's times that she's out of her depth. She was recently in a committee, and she actually delegated the answer to a junior minister because she didn't know how to answer. So I don't think she's overly impressive. Um, and I do think sometimes she is a little bit populist for populist sake, and that isn't practical. But I do think the left is also guilty of weaponizing race. And, the fact is, The Guardian and other left wing sources and opinions will constantly, constantly, constantly take this knee jerk reaction whenever basically any minority group is discussed in a negative way, even if it is based on fact. So, for example, saying that there is a problem with black on black crime in London, saying that there is an issue with Islamist extremism in this country, saying that there is a specific problem in some towns with British Pakistani grooming gangs. None of that is racist because it's all based on empirical facts. Now, if Braverman was to come out and say all British Pakistani men are predators, that would be racist. So I just think the left are playing with words here, but the caveat is I do think Braverman is being a little bit populist for populist sake as well. She's in a position of enormous responsibility, and talking about invasion, it's not accurate and it isn't. It's not helpful either. As a matter of record, by the way, there's countries that take a lot more migrants than we do. Italy certainly faces the bulk of it. Turkey and Pakistan, I understand, have more refugees than almost any other country in the world. So the DRC has had refugees for decades. Um, so actually, in terms of the numbers, Britain is not that high up the list. But it is a problem that needs to be solved. And people who think that there should be no checks, that there should be this unlimited number of people coming in without being vetted, it's not sustainable. We're an island country, and we may be wealthy, but there is a lot of things that need to be taken care of, and we cannot simply have this constant stream of people risking their lives, tragedies happening. Actually, I was looking at the situation in the Mediterranean last night, and I worked out that 24,000 people plus, this is based on the statistics year by year from 2007 to now, over 24,000 people have drowned in the Mediterranean. That's horrendous. And this is happening more and more, and there's a risk that the English Channel will start to resemble a big maritime graveyard as well. So it's a human tragedy. I think the Home Office is right to focus on criminalising these evil people traffickers, but language like that doesn't help. Um, and I think that both right and left are guilty of going to the extremes. The right sort of is like, well, they're all illegal. Let's just treat them all like criminals, and I think that's a little bit inhumane, given that some of these people, even if they are technically coming here illegal, are facing awful situations. It's not as black and white as saying they should go to the nearest safe country. Um, I'll give you an example. I knew a young Iranian guy, a Christian, and he was in France. He got right through Europe illegally, but he said basically at Calais it was terrible. There were Islamists there. Now, being a Christian, obviously he was under threat. So some people would say, well, France is a safe country. Is it in that sense? It's just not that black and white. Um, so that's where the right is wrong to sort of oversimplify this. But I think the left also oversimplify it, basically saying, well, we have to be humane and just let everyone in. No, that's foolish. There are people that absolutely shouldn't be here, who do not have values compatible to our own, who lie about their age, for example, pretend to be children when they're actually young men, um, and in some cases come with Islamist attitudes towards women, towards LGBT people. They absolutely shouldn't be here. So that's why there should be vetting. There's no simple answer to this problem. Both sides need to use responsible language, and I include the left in that, branding all their critics as racist or branding anyone with a different worldview as racist or short-sighted or far right is pretty odious. And it's one thing I really dislike about the left. They've always, always, always weaponized race. They also cherry pick what racism is. So right now they're vilifying Suella Braverman because she's, hardline Tory, but they're fine with, put it this way: a black transgender left-wing activist who vilifies white people, you could be damn sure the Guardian will be hailing that person or defending them. So there is absolute double standards and inconsistency in what they call racism. And it isn't just the Guardian, there's other examples too. Anyway, that's okay, longer video, but that's my take on it. I just think that language, people need to be responsible with language, but it goes both ways. And I think both left and right are guilty of hyperbole.